The first part of the series is called Pharmacy. An elderly woman named Olive Kitteridge came to the autumn forest, and leaving a farewell note, was about to voluntarily pass away. The events then take us 25 years back. Olive and her husband Henry live in a country house. Henry congratulated his wife on Valentine's Day, but she reacted indifferently, continuing to make coffee. It was quite a cold winter. In the morning, Henry as usual went to work. He is a pharmacist and the owner of the local pharmacy. A woman named Rachel Coulson tried to buy medicine with an invalid prescription. Henry politely explained to Rachel that he couldn't sell her 2 doses of Valium. Rachel suffers from depression and seeks salvation in medications. She plans to go to a pharmacy in another town. The pharmacy worker Lois lost consciousness outside. Asking a passing woman to call an ambulance, Henry tried to resuscitate Lois, but in vain. Henry couldn't believe that Lois was gone. In the evening at dinner, Henry told his son Christopher and wife about Lois's demise. However, Christopher didn't care. He never liked the woman, who was his father's old friend. Olive shared the son's feelings, believing that Lois wasn't worthy of being grieved for. The family relationships are tense. Olive is unhappy that Christopher is not taking school seriously, while his father isn't strict enough with him. When Henry offered to help the son with his homework, he refused and left the table. Olive is constantly irritable and looks for any excuse to argue with her husband. She threw his Valentine's Day card in the trash because she hates junk. A month passed. A young girl, Denise Thibodeau, will work at the pharmacy instead of Lois. Incidentally, Denise's husband's name is also Henry. During the lunch break, Denise suggested the idea of starting to sell greeting cards in the pharmacy so that people in line, thinking of their loved ones, would buy them. Henry approved this initiative and asked Jerry McCarthy, another pharmacy worker, to set up special stands. Denise turned out to be a sweet, open girl with an infectious laugh. Henry had forgotten what genuine laughter sounded like. Olive works as a math teacher at school and is very strict with her students. She doesn't have warm relationships with any colleagues except for Jim O'Casey, an English teacher. Next to him, Olive can be herself. After school, Olive and Jim gave Kevin, one of the students, a ride because his mother couldn't pick him up again. Due to her depression, Rachel wasn't even able to get off the couch. Olive persistently advised Rachel to stop abusing medications, but she couldn't pull herself together. Meanwhile, Olive's relationship with her own son is getting worse. She can even afford to slap him. In the evening, Henry said he wanted to invite Denise and her husband for dinner. Naturally, Olive was not enthusiastic about the idea. Henry denies that his wife is depressed, but Christopher disagrees. In his opinion, the mother shows all the signs of depression. In the morning, Henry was getting ready for work. Jim as usual drove Olive and Christopher to school. Denise is very kind to everyone, including Jerry, who has become more confident, thanks to her support. Henry couldn't help but notice this. It's no wonder that Denise's husband, a former high school football star, chose this sincere bright girl over some arrogant cheerleader. When Henry invited Denise and her husband to dinner, she gladly accepted. In the evening, the young couple came to the Kitteridge house. Olive tried to be polite, though she couldn't completely hide her irritation. Christopher wasn't very friendly either and left the table at the first opportunity. Henry tried to keep a casual conversation with the guests, while Olive looked tired. She clearly didn't want to listen to this idle chatter. The next morning, Henry went hunting in the woods with Denise's husband and his friend Tony Cuzio. At some point, Tony fired a shot, accidentally hitting his friend. While Tony ran for help, Henry stayed with the guy and did everything he could to keep him conscious. But a few minutes later, the young man passed away. Soon after, there was a funeral and a wake. Everyone remembered Henry as a good guy who never did anything wrong. Denise had a fit of hysterical laughter from the shock. Tony threw a tantrum, begging Henry's father to punish him. This would have allowed Tony to partially relieve his conscience. Eventually, the guy was taken away from the wake. Olive felt no emotions as usual. It seems Jim is the only one who understands her. Henry is very worried about Denise, believing she is too helpless to live on her own. Olive, however, doesn't care. Henry offered to teach Denise how to drive. The girl was very grateful to her older friend, who had not left her alone after her husband's demise. Henry feels lonely and doesn't want Denise to feel the same. He would like Denise to come over for dinner more often. Remembering her husband, Denise cries every time. He was perfect and shouldn't have left so early. To comfort the girl, Henry hugged her. In the evening, Denise did come to dinner at the Kitteridge's house. However, due to her melancholy, she couldn't eat and kept crying. Henry began spoon-feeding Denise, making his son and wife feel uncomfortable. However, Henry wasn't embarrassed at all and continued doing it. Denise fell asleep on the couch in the living room, and Henry covered her with a blanket. Olive wasn't very happy that Denise would stay in their house overnight, but didn't object. Henry feels the need to take care of someone because his family never gave him a sense of being needed. 3 weeks passed. Denise was getting ready to go back to work after her leave, and Henry decided to cut some flowers from the garden for her. This irritated Olive, who had been waiting for those flowers to bloom after a long winter. In the end, Henry lost the mood to gather a bouquet, so he gave Denise a kitten instead. The girl was thrilled and introduced Jerry to her new pet. Upon learning that Tony would now be teaching Denise to drive, Henry was somewhat confused. Asking Denise for a private conversation, Henry told her that spending time with Tony was a bad idea. But Denise thinks Tony is good. Besides, he feels better helping his late friend's beloved. Henry left disappointed. At dinner, Olive sensed that something was bothering her husband. When Christopher joked about Denise's appearance, it made his father very angry. Christopher witnessed another argument between his parents at the table. Olive called Henry pathetic. After learning that Jim is a frequent daredevil on the road, Henry decided to take Olive and Christopher to school himself from now on. Tony distracts Denise even during work, which really upsets Henry. Jerry shared good news: he got accepted to university to study economics. Henry didn't have the strength to be genuinely happy for Jerry. Denise was the first to take a step towards reconciliation. She didn't want to be rude, she just wanted Tony not to feel guilty. Henry hugged Denise, believing that she would pass her driving test today. That same evening after the workday, Denise drove to the pharmacy to personally tell Henry about her success in the exam. Later, Denise called Henry in tears and said she didn't notice her kitten near the house when she was parking. Of course, Henry was ready to rush to her right away. Christopher and Olive, however, were indifferent to the girl's sorrow. Throughout the evening, Henry comforted the young widow, promising to always take care of her. With Henry, Denise felt calm. Later, the Kitteridges met with their friends at a bar to celebrate Olive's birthday. Jim, who was getting drunk near the bar, wrote something on a napkin. The couple returned home in silence. Seeing 2 police cars, they became worried. Realizing that Jim had been in an accident and perished, Olive was in real shock. She cried inconsolably all night. A few weeks later at the pharmacy, Henry watched Denise carefully as she dusted. Denise was also looking at him. By the way, Jerry received a full scholarship. He has every chance for a better future. Speaking to Jerry alone, Henry said he was worried about the fact that Denise didn't have any friends her own age. Henry gave the guy some money to take Denise out somewhere. After work, Henry asked his wife, who was working in the garden, if she would leave him. Olive expected to hear anything but that. Nevertheless, she didn't give a direct answer. The second part begins. Incoming tide. Rachel started having hallucinations, which scares her son Kevin. Many years later, Olive will meet her former student, Kevin Coulson, and recognize him immediately. Some time ago he moved to New York and went to college to become a psychiatrist. But now Kevin has a desire to visit his hometown. When Kevin asked how Christopher was doing, Olive replied that he works as a podiatrist here in town. Tomorrow is Christopher's wedding. His fiancée is also a doctor. All these years, Olive often thought of Kevin. His mother Rachel was a good woman. Too bad bipolar disorder ruined her. Before doing the rash act, she sent her son an email. Olive understands Kevin because her father suffered from depression. It's a common occurrence in their family. Kevin's personal life isn't going well yet. His ex-girlfriend was as crazy as his mother. They recently broke up. Kevin doesn't tell anyone that he sometimes experiences hallucinations too. Olive continued to talk about the events of recent years. Some time ago she retired. At one point, Olive was horrified to notice that Patty Howe, a former classmate of Kevin and Christopher, had fallen into the water. Kevin immediately rushed to help her. Fortunately, the girl was fine. She was just cold. The past haunts Kevin. Since childhood, he has experienced hallucinations like his mother. Olive kindly offered Kevin to stay at their house overnight. In the evening, Olive and Henry invited him to Christopher's wedding rehearsal and introduced him to all the relatives. Kevin clearly felt uncomfortable being here. Everyone was talking about Kevin's heroic act of saving Patty today. Christopher seemed glad to see his former classmate and introduced him to his fiancée, Suzanne. Kevin avoided further interaction with anyone, feeling out of place. Noticing a photo of Jim and a napkin with writing on it near the bar, Kevin asked what it said. It turned out to be a quote from a depressing poem. Kevin remembers his teacher Jim, who often gave him a ride home after school because his mother was unable to get off the couch. Kevin's father had another family in Arizona, but he regularly sent money. Jim believed that Rachel was hindering her son's life and that he would be better off moving in with his father. But Kevin couldn't leave the mother. In the present at the bar, Kevin listens to Angela O'Mara, Jim's widow, singing, and sees flowers growing on the piano. Henry gave a toast. He was truly happy that his son was marrying such an amazing girl like Suzanne. Henry was proud that Christopher had grown into a good hard-working man. Christopher was very touched. The mother had never said such words to him. On the way home, while Kevin was also in the car, Olive expressed her dissatisfaction to the husband, saying that Joyce, Suzanne's mother, wasn't as nice as she seemed. Henry didn't understand why his wife thought that. The Kitteridges insisted that Kevin attend the wedding tomorrow. He had no reason to refuse. Suddenly that same evening, Olive asked Kevin to go outside with her. She had already guessed that he had returned to his hometown to share the mother's fate. But right now in front of Olive, he threw the gun away. There's the wedding in the morning, so it's time for them to go to bed. However, Kevin packed his things and left without saying goodbye. Olive didn't stop him. Kevin stood for a long time on the edge of the steep rocky shore, remembering how he saved Patty. He didn't tell anyone that Patty had deliberately jumped into the water and didn't want to be saved. Several failed pregnancies had broken her. Later he met Patty at a cafe. She feels guilty that Kevin risked his life for her. Suddenly Kevin directly asked Patty if she had intentionally jumped into the water. The girl denied it. At one point Kevin couldn't hold back and started crying. Patty took his hand in support. Olive put on a dress that she had specially sewn for the wedding. The husband said she looked stunning. 3 weeks earlier, Henry had told his wife that Denise and Jerry were planning to visit this area briefly to see his parents. Henry had invited the couple over. Olive, busy sewing the dress, wasn't too thrilled about it. Denise showed Henry a photo of her sons. It seems she and Jerry have settled well in life. Their oldest son is already over 13 years old. No one noticed how quickly time flew by. Olive mentioned that Henry sold his pharmacy. Denise is sure that no one will take care of people as well as Henry did. He in turn noted that Jerry often nags his wife about nothing. Jerry is not the humble guy he used to be. Watching the couple leave, Henry said that Denise would have been happier with her late husband. Olive of course was not so sentimental and was simply glad that the guests had finally left. In the present, the Kitteridges are going to their son's wedding. Henry is glad that Christopher and his wife decided to stay in this town. It means he and Olive are decent parents after all. Joyce and Olive clearly dislike each other, and Olive doesn't hesitate to show it. Henry asked his wife to be friendlier, receiving a sarcastic comment in response. Joyce is far from the only guest Olive has clashed with. This is a very important day for Christopher, and he wants everything to go smoothly. The fact that Kevin won't be at the wedding didn't upset Christopher one bit. Everyone considers Kevin strange. Also, Christopher is glad that Suzanne's family lives far away and will leave soon. Their relatives clearly wouldn't get along. During the ceremony, Olive shamelessly ate nuts and talked loudly, drawing everyone's attention. Joyce feared that Olive would ruin the celebration. After the ceremony, as the wind started to blow hard, all the guests went inside, but Olive stayed outside, picking up trash with a disgruntled look. Henry convinced his wife to come inside. She continued to openly show her displeasure and refused to eat cake with the others. Feeling tired, Olive went upstairs to Christopher and Suzanne's bedroom. Henry, worried about his wife, joined her. They bought this house for their son to start his family here. Henry is sure that Christopher married a good girl. Olive didn't argue with her husband and told him to return to the guests. Left alone, she cried, remembering how she cared for little Christopher when he was sick. Joyce interrupted Olive's solitude, and Olive made it clear that she didn't want to see anyone. Since the door was left slightly open, Olive overheard Suzanne telling her friend that she liked Christopher's father but not his mother. The girls also discussed her dress, calling it awful. In retaliation, Olive decided to ruin some of Suzanne's belongings and steal one of her shoes and an earring. After this, Olive left the room as if nothing had happened. After the celebration, the Kitteridges went to the cafe to eat donuts. Their table was served by Patty, who was grateful to Olive for noticing her fall into the water yesterday. Patty even called Olive her guardian angel. In the restroom, Olive threw Suzanne's things in the trash. Later, Henry told his wife that their son had a happy life ahead of him. Olive didn't tell her husband about the overheard conversation. Before bed, Suzanne noticed her earring was missing and searched the entire room for it, but to no avail. The third part begins, a different road. The Kitteridges rented out their son's house to a family for the summer. Henry became interested in wood carving and made a bowl from a log once given to him by Denise's late husband. Henry thought Denise would be happy with such a gift. Suddenly Christopher called, whose voice sounded very worried. He urgently wanted to talk to his parents. It turned out that Christopher and Suzanne were having problems in their marriage. They even went to a family therapist, but it didn't help. Now Christopher and his wife live in California. He plans to stay for now because there are more clients. Henry was genuinely concerned for the son and sympathized with him, unlike Olive, who was more indifferent to this news. Neither she nor Henry expected Christopher and Suzanne's marriage to fall apart so soon. Olive believes that the son should build his life independently and not return to this town. To keep herself busy, Olive scrubbed the refrigerator. Henry was saddened by the fact that they still didn't have grandchildren. He wished things had turned out differently. Later, Henry went to the pharmacy that once belonged to him. Now the attitude towards clients was completely different. In line, Henry struck up a conversation with a married couple, Linda and Jack Kennison. Seeing a stand with greeting cards, Henry remembered that Father's Day was coming up. However, not everyone considers it important. Henry bought a "My Wife" card to please Olive. Arriving home, he handed her the card and a bouquet of flowers. Henry wants his wife to remember that he loves her. Olive loves Henry too, she is just more reserved in her feelings. In the evening, the Kitteridges met with the friends at a restaurant. Bonnie and Harmon Newton have a granddaughter, but according to them, things aren't as rosy as they might seem. Sometimes children can be unbearable. On the way home in the car, Henry said it was terrible when children are rude to elders. Olive replied that if they had grandchildren, she would quickly put them in their place. Henry has long wanted to go on vacation somewhere warm. Suddenly Olive felt a severe pain in her stomach and asked the husband to urgently drive to the hospital. He had to disregard traffic rules. Olive barely made it to the restroom. It was probably the result of dinner with the friends. Noticing a rash on Olive, the emergency room nurse advised her to stay in the hospital. It could be seafood poisoning. After warning her husband that she would be delayed, Olive returned to the emergency room. The doctor examined her while Henry waited at reception, chatting with the nurse named Patricia. Suddenly people with guns and masks burst into the hospital. Olive suspected nothing until the masked people, pointing guns at her, told her to go to the hallway. Henry, Olive and the medical staff were held tied up in a ward. One of the guys watched over them while his accomplice searched for substances. This guy took off his mask, ordering the hostages not to stare at him. When Henry reprimanded the criminal about the foul language, it set the guy off. Olive said in a panic that her husband was just out of his mind with fright. Olive herself wasn't afraid to look into the face of the bandit, who was clearly nervous. His hands were shaking. Seeing that his accomplice had taken off his mask, the first guy was furious and ordered him to make everyone stay silent. Frightened Patricia began praying aloud. It seemed like the worst moment for an argument, but the couple started to fight anyway. In the heat of the argument, Olive confessed to her husband that she had long planned to divorce him, but Jim's demise changed everything. Hearing this, Henry burst into hysterical laughter, as did Olive. After all, Henry had also been in love with Denise, and his wife suspected it. So Olive and Henry were worthy of each other. Hearing police sirens, the criminal was going to voluntarily pass away but didn't have time. The police officers captured him. Later at home, the couple told their son over the phone about what had happened. Henry was emotional, unlike Olive, who pretended that nothing unusual had occurred. Before bed, Henry wanted to talk to his wife about the incident at the hospital, but she had no desire to discuss it. The next day, however, Olive, for the first time in their marriage, asked Henry for forgiveness. Olive regretted telling her husband about the affair with Jim. Henry didn't hold a grudge against his wife, understanding that they were in a critical situation yesterday and everything was said under the influence of emotions. 8 months later, while Olive was cleaning up dry leaves in the yard, Henry suddenly felt unwell and fell. After a stroke, Henry ended up confined to a wheelchair. At the first opportunity, Christopher visited his parents. It was painful for him to see the father in such a condition. Olive completely devoted herself to caring for the husband. She regularly attends a support group for people with disabled relatives. She doesn't particularly like it, but it's hard to cope alone. Olive does everything she can. Her husband lives in a nursing home where he receives proper care, but Olive visits him every day. Christopher doesn't mind that the mother wants to sell his house. After the divorce, he didn't seek new relationships and is undergoing psychotherapy. Suzanne didn't take any of his property. The mother and son argued because Christopher rarely visits them. The guy admitted to his mother that he almost never calls her because after each conversation, he feels like he's been dragged through the mud. When Christopher was a child, the mother often said terrible things to him. Now Christopher wants Olive to finally acknowledge that she was a bad mother. Olive burst into tears, not understanding why no one has ever pitied her in her life. In the end, the mother and son reconciled, deciding to leave their grievances in the past. They both are struggling with Henry's illness. Soon Olive saw her son off at the airport, then visited her husband at the nursing home again. Henry tried to say something to her but couldn't. Later, Olive ran into an old acquaintance, Cynthia, whose daughter recently became a social worker. Olive remembers Andrea, who was her student and got poor grades in math. After an unflattering comment about her daughter's intelligence, Cynthia of course lost the desire to help. Olive received a card with words of support from Louise Larkin, whose son was also Olive's former student. Despite the fact that the women had not gotten along in the past, Olive came to visit Louise. The fate of Louise's son Doyle has not been easy. Louise mentioned that one of the guys who broke into the hospital is in the same facility as Doyle. Louise misses her son very much. Every evening Olive tells the husband about how her day went. Henry is the kindest person she has ever known. He always tried to help anyone in need. Olive can't let the dearest person to her die alone. She will be there when it happens because she genuinely loves him. Olive can't get Louise's words about that guy out of her head. By the way, Louise has gone mad and become embittered with the world, especially her husband. Olive regrets her decision to visit this woman. A nurse woke Olive because it was time to change the patient's bed sheets. Olive told her husband that she would come back later and that she was going home to feed their dog. From now on, Olive lives mechanically, finding no joy in anything. Her depression is worsening. The last part begins. Security. 4 years have passed. Henry is still alive, and the wife continues to diligently care for him. Now they are about to be apart for the longest time because Olive is going to visit their son in New York. On the plane, Olive chatted with a nice elderly woman and mentioned that her son's new wife is 3 months pregnant. By the way, she has children from a previous relationship, but Christopher doesn't seem to mind. Christopher met his mother at the airport. Christopher regrets that he can't visit his father, his wife, and finds it difficult to travel with the children. Olive told the son that his father would be happy if they all visited together. Christopher showed his mother the house. Olive finally got to meet Anne in person, who unlike Suzanne wasn't beautiful. In addition, the girl has 2 small children. The baby girl was constantly crying, and 4-year-old Theo was unbearable. Olive was surprised that Anne allowed herself to drink beer during pregnancy. Olive didn't know that Christopher and Anne had a lodger. Christopher assured that the man wasn't intrusive. Anne calls Olive mom and is very different from Christopher's ex-wife. When she went into the house, the mother and son were able to talk alone in the backyard. Christopher said that Anne suits him. They met in group therapy. Anne had a difficult childhood. Her mother was an alcoholic, and her father was a Marine. Olive asked if it bothered him that Anne drank during pregnancy. Christopher replied no. He feels much better now, managing his depression with medication. Olive doesn't take any medication, not considering it a solution to the problem. When the guy renting the room introduced himself as Sean O'Casey, Olive immediately remembered Jim O'Casey. Christopher has no idea if Sean is related to Jim, and he isn't interested. Olive decided to help Anne in the kitchen. Despite her hard life, Anne hasn't become bitter and does everything she can to raise her children with love. Suddenly Olive felt nauseous and went to the restroom. She was annoyed by Theo constantly knocking on the door. Olive was accommodated in the basement, the cleanest place in the house. She called her husband, who though unable to speak, could listen. Olive doesn't like the new daughter-in-law, but it seems Christopher is happy, and that's the most important thing. Sometimes Olive thinks about how her life would have turned out if she had left her husband for Jim. But that will never happen. Olive was awakened by screams upstairs. Theo was being fussy, not wanting to go to daycare. Olive escorted the boy and asked the teacher to be stricter with him. In the evening, Christopher told his mother about Sean, who has lived in New York all his life and doesn't work anywhere. He is a writer, but clearly hasn't succeeded yet. Theo irritated Olive with his clingy behavior. Unable to stand it, she gave him a slap on the back of the head. Outraged Christopher didn't even know what to say. Anne resolved the conflict peacefully, politely asking Olive to apologize to Theo. Later, the whole family went to a cafe to have ice cream. Olive tried her best to keep herself together. In the evening, Olive complained to the husband, unable to hold back her tears. Olive really misses Henry. She's sorry not appreciating him earlier. The next morning, Olive announced that she wanted to leave. She absolutely doesn't like being here and hearing Anne call her mom. Christopher is tired of enduring his mother's mood swings. All his childhood he had to put up with her terrible temper, but now Christopher has a choice, and he isn't going to persuade his mother to stay. Olive doesn't understand why she deserves such treatment from her son. Christopher never lacked anything, but it seems he didn't feel motherly love. At the airport, Olive made a scene. Overall, this crazy trip was very hard for her, so she was glad to return home. After picking flowers from the garden, Olive was going to visit her beloved husband. It turned out that Henry had passed away yesterday. It happened in his sleep. The nursing home management left Olive a message, but she never received it. Olive didn't keep her promise, allowing her husband to die alone. She didn't want to hear words of sympathy, considering it hypocrisy. Henry didn't deserve such an end. 6 months passed. Olive still hadn't come to terms with her husband's demise. All her days were monotonous and dull. Only the need to walk her pet forced Olive to leave the house. In the park near a bench, Olive saw a man lying on the ground. He was conscious, and surprisingly remained calm. Olive was about to go for help, but the man asked her not to leave him alone. Olive helped the man sit up. He only remembered feeling dizzy during his walk. Olive didn't immediately recognize the man. His name was Jack Kennison. They occasionally crossed paths in town. Jack, whose wife passed away of cancer in December, understands Olive like no one else. Losing someone you've spent your whole life with is very hard. Neither Jack nor Olive have any reason to wake up in the morning. Olive walked Jack to his expensive car and followed him just in case. However, Jack was already feeling much better. Olive declined Jack's invitation to come over for lunch. Before she left, he gave her his calling card. Olive's life had become completely empty. She doesn't really live anymore, just exists. If not for the need to take care of her pet, Olive would have voluntarily left this world long ago. Olive decided to call Jack after all and suggested they go to a restaurant together. He agreed. Olive immediately said she would pay for herself. Later Jack picked her up. Olive felt ridiculous in his expensive car. Jack wasn't used to a woman being so straightforward. Olive always says what she thinks. Over dinner, Olive shared that she sometimes hated Henry, but now he seems perfect to her. In the past 6 months, the son hasn't spoken to her. Olive has no intention of making the first move towards reconciliation. Jack also doesn't talk to his daughter because of her non-traditional orientation. When Olive called Jack an intolerant person, unable to put himself in others' shoes, he said she was no better. Olive no longer wanted to stay here and intended to pay for herself, which offended Jack. In the end, advising him to drive carefully, Olive simply left. She arrived home in a cab and found that her dog was not moving and whining. Olive didn't expect to receive a voicemail from Anne, who informed her that she had given birth. Christopher wouldn't have liked it, but Anne believes that Olive has the right to know about the birth of the grandson, who was named Kyle. Olive took her pet to the vet clinic and returned home alone. Later, she wrote letters to Denise and Christopher. Olive no longer has anything keeping her in this life, so she went to the park, where she wanted to end it all. Leaving a farewell note and turning on classical music, Olive took a gun. However, she was distracted by children playing in the park. Olive had to change her plans. Out of despair, she burst into tears. Later, Olive decided to visit Jack, but no one answered the door. Since it was unlocked, Olive went inside. Jack wasn't feeling well and couldn't get out of bed. Olive brought him her tulips, even though she usually doesn't give it to anyone. Hearing that Olive had become a grandmother, Jack advised her to mend her relationship with the son. Jack would also like to reconcile with his daughter, but he can't accept her lifestyle. Both Olive and Jack had been unfaithful spouses, which they now regret. Now in the twilight of their lives, they both want peace. Olive wants to hope that there will still be something good in her life. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel not to miss more exciting new products. Also, the authors will be pleased if you leave your opinion in the comments.